All right, ladies and gentlemen. Big round of applause for the quietness. Welcome to week 3 of our 2014 6-week series. Is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-week series. It was six weeks last year. And this year's series, as you know, is called Deep Time, Global Change, and You. And our first 2 weeks, we learned how fossilized leaves and fossilized bugs could tell us about, inform us about our place in the world and perhaps a little bit about our future. And today we're going to learn about how fossilized charcoal can tell us a little bit about our place in the world and perhaps about our future. And it gives me great pleasure, and it is an honor, to introduce Professor Cathy Whitlock from the State University of Montana in Bozeman. Now, she is extremely distinguished, and she has an incredibly long CV. I think the most important things to keep in mind is that she is the director of the Montana Institute on Ecosystems, and her major project, if I'm right, current major project, is a multi-university consortium that's looking at how climate change will affect fire regimes around the world, so in New Zealand, in Tasmania, and in the United States. She is the past president of the Quaternary Society Association. She was invited to be a fellow of the AAAS in 2012, which is a great honor. She's been at the University of Montana for a few years. Before that, she was at the University of Oregon. And before that, she had an incredible number of posts all over the world, including Trinity College Dublin and the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, and even the Academica Sinica in Beijing. She has got her PhD and her master's from the University of Washington near here. And she is, in fact, by training, a geologist. So she is going to tell us about a long view of fire, climate, and people perspectives from the paleoecological record. So please join me in welcoming Cathy Whitlock. And we will hope that there we go, from the start. And you're wired up.
Can you all hear me? Great. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here and be participating in this really interesting symposium. So I'm very grateful for the invitation. And Rolf Matthews, who was responsible for inviting me, said that the Olympics don't start in Canada until the hockey puck drops. Is that true? And so I'm really appreciative that you're all here tonight and not watching the Olympics for one night. I want to talk to you about this topic of fire tonight and give you my perspective as a paleo fire person and tell you why I think that paleo perspective is really critical for understanding what's happening today and what's likely to be happening in the future. And we all know that fire has been on the news a lot in the last few years. And it's a subject that's been talked about both in the scientific press, but in the popular media as well. And the reason for that is because almost every year now, we've seen more large fires than anyone can remember. And this is true in Canada, it's true in the US, it's true around the world, it's true in Australia. And so people want to know what's going on. Is this a harbinger of global warming? Is this something that's going to be in our future? Or are we just looking at an anomaly? And I think it's important to remember that when we talk about global biomass burning, we're not the most important place on the planet when that happens. This is 1 week of satellite data, of MODIS data this summer. And the red dots are showing you fire starts around the world. And, you know, we get our hands are ringing in the Rocky Mountain region and boreal forest area because we have a lot of fires, but actually we're not the major fire player in the world. That's really the subtropics around the world. And a lot of these are human-set fires, annual field burning and that sort of thing, but that's really the big carbon-producing engine. To understand the current fires, it's important to recognize that really what drives fire are four things. And fires are the same everywhere where they happen around the world. You have to know something about the vegetation, and by that I mean the composition of the fuels and the level of the fuels, the structure of the fuels. You have to know something about climate, and not just the mean state, the average state, but climate variability, and especially seasonal climate conditions is really important. And then the third variable is people, because people through time both start fires and they put fires out. So they're responsible for ignitions, adding ignitions, but also eliminating fires. And so it sounds pretty simple, but it's really the arrows between these things that get complicated, and the strength of the arrows and the feedbacks between these elements changes depending on the temporal and spatial scale that you're talking about. And that's why a paleo perspective is important. So today I thought I'd give you a bit of an overview about fires in the past, what we know about long-term fires, looking at the geologic record. I'd like to tell you a little bit about how we reconstruct past fire regimes, and give you some examples of how those linkages look when we look at the fire-climate linkage versus the fire-people linkage on different time scales. And then kind of get to the so what of the talk, why should we care about paleo fire science? Fires have been around for a long time. They're nothing new. We talk about large stand replacing fires now around the world, but actually you can go back to these sequoia trees in the Eocene in Yellowstone, and you can look at the tree rings and you can see fire scars on them. So you know that in Yellowstone in the Eocene, these sequoias were burning, had surface fires, very much like you would see in Northern California today. And it's interesting, when you look at fire records in geologic time, it's very tightly linked to levels of oxygen in the atmosphere. So this is work that was done by Andrew Scott. Let me see if I can, where he starts in the Silurian and goes to the Permian, so we're in the Paleozoic, going from old to young. And here's two different reconstructions of atmospheric oxygen levels. And what he points out is that to get fires to happen, you have to have oxygen levels in the atmosphere of between about 12% and about 35%. That's the real critical burn zone. If you have less oxygen than that, you won't have enough for combustion, you won't have a forest fire. And if you have more than 35%, you'll have just a cataclysmic fireball explosion. And he notes that here's the reconstruction of oxygen through the Paleozoic, and really it's associated with these major events in plant evolution. The first vascular plants, the diversification of land plants, the first forests, development of upland vegetation, and then widespread mires. And with each of these steps, you can look at the geologic record for those steps and see that there's evidence of charcoal in the record causing those transitions. So he argues very strongly that fires are part and parcel of the evolution of plants, and they have been for a long time, but that didn't happen until we had the right levels of oxygen in the atmosphere. Just to give you another paleo example, this was a paper that came out recently looking at the transition from the Triassic to the Jurassic in a set of rocks in East Greenland. And what they found was that when you make that transition, you all of a sudden lose the broadleafed species in the paleobotany record, and you move into a period where the taxa are more narrow-leafed and conifer taxa dominated. And that transition is associated with a big spike in charcoal right there. And the argument is that that transition from the Triassic to the Jurassic was associated with a major volcanic event that released greenhouse gases, it changed the weather, and it caused widespread fires, and that in turn led to major changes in the sorts of plants that were adapted to disturbance. Moving up the geologic column, there's a lot of thinking now that the rise of subtropical grasslands in the Miocene was probably also tied very closely to a change in fire regime. And this is work of John Keeley. He argues that in the Miocene, about 15 million years ago, the climate became much more seasonal. It gave rise to more lightning. This alternating of seasons produced fuels that became dry and wet, increased the fire potential, and you started getting more fires, and that shifted forested vegetation towards these subtropical grasslands. And the evidence that he gives, so here's age, and here's 15 million years ago in 3 sections, is that there's very little charcoal in the records before 15 million years ago, and then after 15 million years ago, fire is really part of these subtropical ecosystems. So I guess that a lot of that burning that you see today, he would argue, started in the Miocene. And then another reason that we know that fire's been around a long time is you can look at the adaptations of living plants to fire and see that there's some really very strong disturbance traits that many plants have that show you that fire's been around a long time and part of their evolutionary history. So for example, we see things like plants that sprout right after fire. Sprouting is a characteristic of biomes where there's a lot of burning. We see serotiny. These are the cones when the pine cones have to be heated to open up and drop their seeds. We see plants that can only germinate after they're in a smoky environment, or that can be dormant for a long time, or that go through these enormous flowering periods after fire. In the Australian flora, for example, it's characterized by this epicormic sprouting. If you've been around, walked through eucalyptus forests, you know that the branches come right out of the stems of the trees, out of the trunks. The leaves come right out after fire. That's a very strong suggestion that those plants have been living with fire and evolved with fire for a very long time. In the same way, these cones of Banksia from Australia are very, they open up after fire, and that suggests that they too are disturbance adapted. So as you move towards younger geologic time period, there's a lot of ways that we can reconstruct past fires. There's a lot of data sets that are available. And it really depends on the time scale that you're interested in as to which one of these tools that you'll grab to reconstruct fire. So if you're running here from wanting to reconstruct fire history for a stand, use one set of tools versus when you're looking at continents. And this is reconstructing fire from days all the way up to millennia. Well, most of us know that you can reconstruct fire from documentary data and remote sensing. That goes back a few decades, and it gives us big global coverage. So that's the most common tool that we use to look at fire activity, but it's very short time scales. As you want to go back in time, you can look at fire scars on tree rings or the age of the trees themselves as a record of past fire, the time the trees got established. And if you want to go back farther on longer time scales and larger spatial scales, you go to lake sediment records. Even ice core records have charcoal particles in them, and they have sugars that are formed after fire that they can geochemically identify in the cores, telling you that there's been fires. And then so that really takes us from talking about fire weather, the kinds of conditions that drive a fire, a particular fire, to looking at this longer term fire climate. And it takes us from a set of models where we're trying to reconstruct what happens after a single fire to looking at fire as an Earth system process. Now, I've been involved in a project funded by the National Science Foundation to look at fire history in wet, temperate forests. So those are like the forests we have here. These are ecosystems that are not like the subtropics. They're ecosystems where fire is rare. And yet, because fire is rare, human influences have been particularly great in altering them. This project, which we call Wildfire Pyre, I wanted to just show you a video because, if I can do this, Well, we're just at the beginning of the Wildfire Pyre project in terms of collecting data. We have teams collecting different pieces of data, so it's different pieces of the puzzle. We're trying to understand how fire is responding to climate change, how it's responding to land use change. We're looking at fire in the past, we're looking at fire today, we're making projections about fire in the future. And all of these puzzle pieces are going to start coming together to make this great collage of fire science, and that's the goal of the project.
My name's Dave McWethy. I'm an assistant research professor at Montana State University. New Zealand is a really interesting place to work because New Zealand is the last place that humans colonized anywhere in the world. And my research focuses on how humans alter natural fire regimes and vegetation and ecosystems. Oh, look at that. Whoa. Taking a column of mud out of these lakes is kind of fun because basically when you get that column of mud, it's like a history book in the past. Sometimes when we pull it out, we say, wow, this is when humans arrived, and you can see the charcoal from burning.
Charcoal analysis tells us about the fire history of an area, and really we can tease apart what's the interaction between climate and people when it comes to fire on the landscape. The past is really the key to the future, and so by seeing how things have responded in the past, we can better anticipate what is going to happen in the future under similar conditions.
My name's Cameron Nafisi. I'm a second-year doctoral student at the University of Colorado in the biogeography lab. What we're looking at are fires that have occurred over the past 100 to maybe 200 or 250 years. And essentially what we're interested in looking at is how the vegetation here has responded to those fires and how is it recovering from those fires. Caprasma 2.7, Conica 12.0. The big story here in New Zealand is that humans have had a very large role to play in wildfire in both the North and the South Island here. And that includes both the indigenous Maori populations that were here and the European settlers that came afterwards, both of whom burned quite a lot.
So a big part of my research here is studying the vegetation structure, the size distribution and height distribution, foliage distribution of the live trees. But along with that, we're collecting tree cores where we can look at the tree rings and find out the ages of the trees. When you drive around or look around the landscape, you can obviously see very strong effects of fire. Is New Zealand becoming more flammable? And if with a warmer climate, do we suspect to see more fire?
Every day is different, really. I think that's what's cool about projects like this. I'm Javier Fernandez. I just graduated from Texas A&M University. Our difficult sites are steep. Sometimes we have to do some crazy acrobatics through, trees or climb up and grab onto whatever we can.
Live Conica 31.9.
I'm an undergraduate research assistant, and so I help Alan and Cameron do all of the sampling. This has been a great opportunity for me. It's experienced a different ecosystem that's absolutely the opposite of what I would have experienced in Texas, and so I've learned a lot.
We're in one of the most southern landscapes on Earth. This is a very extreme environment. This strange land has a legacy of the vegetation that once clothed Antarctica. And one of the features of that vegetation is it seems to be particularly sensitive to very frequent burning.
This is a Aphrotaxis silaginoides, a Kimberley pine, and it's one of about 10,000 dead Kimberley pines in this landscape. So obviously there's been a fire that's killed this tree, so the outer ring of the tree ring chronology that we find should give us a clue as to when these trees died. Yeah. So the pith should give us the establishment date of the tree, so when the tree started growing, and out here near Andreas's thumb should give us the date of the day the tree died, so when it got hit by fire.
And so we want to understand how much and where, and to some extent, these trees actually can survive or coexist with fire.
As an ecologist, admittedly, it's quite exciting because I can see it's a mystery to be solved. It's like, wow, look at all these dead trees, and they're sort of ghost-like figures. But as someone who values, I'm a bushwalker and I love walking in landscapes, so to see death and destruction all around is also quite disturbing, admittedly, and I think most people would admit to that.
I got started as a field researcher. You know, that's what draws you into the science, is just the love of nature and trying to figure out what's going on and walking around and making observations. And so it sort of centers me and is an important part of who I am. We're in Cradle Mountain National Park, and we're right at the transition between rainforest and drier forest in Tasmania. And so we go to lakes and we get vertical cores of sediment, starting with the present day and then going back to when the lake first started. And we study those sediments layer by layer to try to understand the history by looking at the pollen and the charcoal and the diatoms. So this is present day?
That's the present day.
And then it goes back
May well go back 2,000 or 3,000 years to the base.
My name's Simon Haberley, and I'm an Associate Professor at the Department of Archaeology and Natural History at the Australian National University. I grew up in Tasmania on a dairy farm and have a sort of deep interest in this region, and I think as a child growing up, you look at the mountains and you just become awestruck by how massive and impressive they are. That sparked my curiosity about what the place was like in the past. Our main aim, I think, is to produce extremely high quality evidence that will tell us about the frequencies of fire and how climate will influence that. And once we can begin to understand that, we can then really start to make sensible decisions about what's going to happen in the future and how we might adapt to those changes.
Fire is like the canary in the coal mine today, and what we've seen in the last 20 years is more severe fires than we think has happened in recent history. And what gets me excited is trying to understand what's going on today by looking at the past, and hopefully the past can give us a better guide to the future. That was done by an undergraduate film student at our university. As part of our project, we brought him on. And I hope it gives you a flavor for why I just love field work. Just gets you out there. And the name of the game for me is mud. We bring back mud to our lab, and we have glorious few weeks in the field and a couple of years in the lab working on this mud, trying to get not only the fire history, but also the vegetation history and the climate information from those cores so that we can interpret what's going on. And in the mud, we find not only charcoal particles, but of course we're looking at pollen grains, and sometimes we even find insect remains that can tell us things like outbreaks of mountain pine beetle and that sort of thing, and then relate that to fire occurrence. There's a lot of work going on globally on these paleo fire records from lake sediments. In fact, there's now a global community of paleo fire scientists that contribute their data to a database that's available. So you can go to any one of these dots and get fire history information. Now you can see there's some gaps in the dots. There's not much data from Africa for sure. And there's also big areas missing from Asia. And there's places where there aren't lakes, like Central Australia, so there's no fire history data from there, but it's very good coverage, and it's been an extraordinary community effort. Okay, so what do we know? What have we learned? Let's talk about the fire-climate linkages. Well, first let's start on the short term. So let's look at fire occurrence in the western US by season. So these are data from the US Forest Service, and they're showing fire starts. And it's an assemblage of data from 1986 to 1996, and you can see it scrolling through by month. And I've got lightning fires on one side and human-started fires on the other. And you can see that the fire season starts in the American Southwest really pretty early, and then it kind of shoots up into the Rocky Mountains. And then the last fires are sort of coming in the Pacific Northwest, and finally, down in LA area, it's quite late. But can you see there's sort of a spatial pattern? It's not a random thing, these fires. But you also notice that the human-started fires go longer in the year. Can you see that? I think those are like hunter fires. They start earlier and they last later, and of course they're around urban areas. So we took those data and we just said, well, let's just plot them by season, and let's see if there really is a fire season, whether it's a human-started fire or a naturally started fire. And you can see when you look at the lightning fires, there is a very strong fire season. It starts in April in the western US, and it's out by pretty much by October. And the same is true of the human-set fires, except there's sort of broad shoulders. Those are those hunter fires. And you can see there's like one amazing anomaly. Can you believe that?
Are these fires that are out of control?
No, they're just records of fires from the Forest Service. So I think what's going on the 4th of July is that we all go to the forest to celebrate throwing off the yoke of British tyranny, and we get really drunk, and we just set the woods on fire. And then I think there's a little dip right after that, and maybe it's like you wake up and you're like, oh, that wasn't a good idea. But there is a fire season. My point is, it doesn't matter whether the fires are set by lightning or by people. There is a fire season, and that fire season is driven by climate. And so we have to keep that in mind when we try to balance the relative contribution of lightning versus people. I've done a lot of work in Yellowstone. I got started in the 1988 fires, which were so epic and really sort of changed fire policy in the US. And these were very large stand replacing fires. It burned about 40% of the national park. And I went in afterwards to try to see whether I could get more information on the historic fires. For one thing, people said, well, these are the 300-year fires. We haven't seen anything like them in 300 years. We won't see them again for another 300 years. And they had no historical information really to base that on, except the oldest trees were about 300 years old. So one of the things we did is the central part of the park is this big area of lodgepole pine forest, Pinus contorta, and there had been some really great tree ring studies mapping the age of these different stands. So the darker colors are really old stands of lodgepole pine, and the lighter shades of gray are the younger stands. And so the idea is the age of the stand is telling you the date of the last fire. Well, we went in and cored lakes in that area to try to see if we could take the tree ring record of fire and extend it back in time. And so these were the results. So this is present day. Here's 1988. And this goes back to 1200 years AD. And this is the reconstructed area burned. And the reconstruction comes by comparing the area burned from the tree ring study to the amount of charcoal in the cores, and then taking it back in time by just looking at the charcoal in the cores. So the black is the area burned based on the charcoal record, shown here in thousands of hectares. The gray is the tree ring record as it's known from that map, but it ends right there. And so this is all reconstructed from charcoal data. And what you see is 1988 looks like a very anomalous year. More burned in 1988 than burned in that area in any other period in this history. However, if you think about fires over decades, a couple of decades, actually there were decades in the past when that amount of that region burned, or even more. And so 1988 is anomalous in one sense, it happened in a year, but not when you think about what happens over decades. And these decades of large fires also correspond with tree ring climate reconstructions of very dry years. So large fires decades of large fires happen when there's a very dry year or two. Well, then we went to the lake sediments and we got a longer record, and we combined the charcoal record with the pollen data. So here's a record from the central part of the park. It's surrounded by lodgepole pine forest now, and the core went back 17,000 years to the end of the last ice age. And it's a very boring pollen record. The pollen has this big period of yellow taxa shown here. These are tundra, grassland taxa, things like grass and sagebrush and herbs. So it's a grassland for till about 12,000 years ago, and then it's replaced 12,000 years ago by lodgepole pine forest, and it stays lodgepole pine forest for 12,000 years. There's no change in the vegetation, partly because the geology of this part of the park really favors lodgepole pine. So that was boring. But the fire history record was really interesting and surprising. It started out low, not very much charcoal produced during the tundra period. Then it jumped up a step when we get lodgepole pine. That's what you'd expect. You get more forest, you get more charcoal. But these are the individual fire events over the last 17,000 years. Each one of those tick marks is a fire event. And this is just a running average through that set of tick points. And so you can see that it starts out, there's very few fires. Then there's this period of very frequent fires from about 11,000 to 7,000 years ago. And in the last 6,000 years ago, there's been fewer and fewer fires. So the fire frequency changed even when the vegetation did not. This is a really strong argument for a fire-climate linkage, not a fire-fuel linkage. And we know that this period from 11,000 to 7,000 years ago was in fact a period of warmer, drier summers. We know that independently. And that seems to explain the higher fires in the park. This particular diagram was a big message for managers, and if I've had any influence over any managers, it comes from this record, really, because it shows that there isn't a cycle. There isn't a 300-year fire event. In fact, here fires are happening every 75 years to 125 years, and as you go to the present day, fires are happening here every 300 to 400 years. So there is no fire cycle. You cannot manage on a fire cycle because fires are tracking climate, and as climate changes, so too does the fire cycle. Well, there's been some really nice fire history studies done in your neck of the woods, too, that I think are really important. For example, Dan Gavin and Ken Lertzman and others have done some studies in Clayoquot Sound. Now, these are some of the wettest forests, temperate forests on the planet. They took cores here, but the other thing they did is they went around this watershed and they collected particles of charcoal out of the soil. And they got these they kept track of where those particles came from, and they radiocarbon dated those particles and looked at the distribution of the age of those particles in the watershed. And they used those particles to figure out what was the time since the last fire in different parts of the watershed. And so this is a plot of time since fire, and they found that a lot of the fires, in fact, happened in the last 1,000 years. A lot of the particles dated to 1,000 years, so that was the time since the last fire. But there's some places that hadn't burned for 2,000 years, 4,000 years, 8,000 years. There's some sites that hadn't burned for 12,000 years. The youngest particle coming from a fire was 12,000 years old. So that's amazing because it says these are really wet forests. The trees are really old, but they do burn but they don't burn often everywhere. And what they found is that these frequently burned sites were, of course, the south-facing slopes. That's where they were getting the young charcoal. And the north-facing slopes, where some of those sites hadn't burned for 8 or 10 or 12,000 years. Not many of us have a radiocarbon dating budget in our grants that we can duplicate this study. So we're like, oh, wow, that's just really amazing. Terry LaCourse was a former student of Rolf's, and her student did a nice study also from Pender Island looking at fire history. And their focus was on the last, 1,400 years. And here's their charcoal record. And here's what they think are the fire events that they're pulling out as the peaks. And here's the size of those fires. So there's like a big whopping fire there and some smaller fires here. And here's the return interval. So this is the years between fires. What they found was that during the medieval climate anomaly, or this warm period that happened about 800 to 1200 AD, fires were very frequent. The interval between fires was very short. There were very frequent fires. And then during the Little Ice Age, which is about 600 to 200 years ago, the return interval between fires got really long, but the fires were big. See the size of that peak. And so this, too, is a kind of a management story that they pointed out, and that probably a lot of our trees got established during this time when fires were infrequent, during the Little Ice Age. And that's why a lot of our old-growth forests tend to be about 500, 600 and younger. That Little Ice Age, that cool, wet period, was a time when there were fewer fires and trees could get established. And then the global database gives us yet another perspective on fire and climate. This is all of that data that I showed you on the global map, all 600 sites. And what they find is here's a temperature record from the Greenland ice sheet going back 22,000 years ago to present. So this is ice core records of climate. Here's the global charcoal record for the northern hemisphere. It tracks pretty nicely the temperature record. So it's low during the glacial period. It rises at about the same time as the Greenland record, and then it pretty much flattens out. It doesn't show this period, which is interesting, but it sort of shows the same general warming. Whereas in the southern hemisphere, here's an Antarctic ice core record showing an earlier but longer warming period before it flattens out. And the southern hemisphere records show that same thing. They have a dip in this period that doesn't show up in the ice core record, but the sort of timing of increasing fire activities tends to track these independent records of temperature. And the northern hemisphere has a slightly different history than the southern hemisphere. So again, no matter what time scale you look at it, whether you're looking at individual fire occurrences from Forest Service data or global data that are spanning thousands of years, there's a very close tracking of fire and climate. Okay, well, what about people in this equation, people in the past? Well, most of us really have a very strong perception that prehistoric people, first of all, knew how to use fire, probably used fire wisely, and they might have even used fire to the extent that they altered the vegetation. So we believe, for example, that the oak woodlands that we have around here were maybe a human-created vegetation type, or my neck of the woods in Oregon, the Willamette Valley, was very strongly modified by people. Some people say the Great Plains vegetation may have been a human-constructed vegetation because of deliberate burning by people. And you find that kind of narrative on every continent, whether you're in the northern hemisphere, Africa, Polynesia, southern hemisphere, or Australia. Well, let's look at what we know a little more closely. On a grand scale, there's people in the ice core community, in particular this scientist, Bill Rudiman, who thinks that humans' impact has been huge through the Holocene, through much of the last 11,000 years. And what he sees when you look at the ice core data, he looks at the methane record or the carbon dioxide record, and he says when you look at every other interglacial, like the Holocene, what you see is that the methane record peaks really early after the glaciation, reaches a peak, and then as you're in this interglacial, the methane slowly declines till you're into the next glacial. So you go glacial, interglacial. But the peak is early on, and then you slowly decline to the next glacial. Same with carbon dioxide. It peaks fairly early in an interglacial, and then it slowly declines until you're into the next glaciation. But Redeman says, look at the Holocene. It's different. He says, about 6,000 years ago, the methane ice core record from Antarctica shows just the opposite. About 6,000 years ago, that trend started to reverse and increase. And the same with carbon dioxide. The trend started to increase, although not as dramatically. And Redeman's hypothesis is this is the human signal, that the Anthropocene really didn't begin 100 years ago. It began earlier in the Holocene, and it's a result of human activity. So what's human activity that am I talking about? He's talking about things like conversion of forest to agriculture, so it's a land use change. It's the increase of rice paddies. It's massive deforestation, and it's fire. And so he sees this difference as being the human signal, and fire is definitely part of that equation. So a lot of us have been running around the world trying to find support for that. And one paper that came out soon after was published in Nature Geosciences, and it said, okay, let's look at the last 2,000 years using that global database, and let's see if there's a hockey stick curve. In other words, the CO2 rise. See if we see that also in the fire record. And then maybe we can pick out if there's a human signal. And so here's the data set that met the criteria. And let's see, here's the hockey stick temperature curve. You know, it's flat, it's declining, and then it jumps up. It also tracks the population curve. Here's the CO2, that's really the hockey stick curve. And then here's land use changes. Here's the charcoal record. So it's a composite of all of these. And what it shows is that there's a tendency, a decline in the amount of charcoal, so that's used as a trend of biomass burning, to about 1750 globally. Then biomass burning rises from 1750 to 1870 AD, and then it drops. This record stops at 1950, so we're not looking at recent fires, but there's a drop from 1870. And so it really doesn't look like the hockey stick curve at all. It shows a decline and then a rise and a drop. And they see this same pattern whether they're looking in North America, South America, Europe, or Australia. It's that same decline, rise, and drop. And how this was attributed really is that this is a long-term climate cooling, such as I showed you at Yellowstone, the decline in fire frequency. But this rise here is related to land clearance, particularly Europeans going around the world deforesting large parts of the world. And that shows up as this global fire signal. And then this decrease is, in part, it's fire suppression, but it's also that they've created a much more patchy mosaic. And so fires don't spread as well, and so fires are smaller and they're less frequent. So that really was not supporting Redeman hypothesis very strongly. And then this came out looking at all the North American records, the charcoal records. This is a combination of tree ring and charcoal records, I should say. And what they found, so here's the temperature trends from 1400 AD to the present. That's not right, 1400 years ago to the present. Here's the temperature line. No, sorry. The black is the dots are the temperature line, and you can see them rising. And the red is the composite of the charcoal data. So it drops at recent times. So there's this really close fidelity between burning and temperature that you see until very recently. So for example, this is the medieval warm period. There's more charcoal, there's more fires, and it's warmer. Here's the Little Ice Age, when you look at all the North American records from Western US, there's a decrease in fires and it's colder. And then you come into the last 100 years and the number of fires have dropped, but the temperatures have warmed. So again, the argument is that is not necessarily fire suppression. That's to some extent true. There is some fire suppression signal, but it's also that the landscape is more fragmented and we have more people and they're just not burning as much. And what this group argues is that that difference is a fire deficit. So if we were really staying in sync with the way we have been through the last 1,400 years, we should be having even more fires than we're having now, if that makes you feel better. We're still in a deficit, even with these big fires. We're not burning as much biomass as we should for the temperatures that we're getting. We're more efficient. We're due for more. So the problem for me has always been, you're trying to find the human signature, but people have been in North America for a long time, as Rolf is going to talk about next week. And climate's been changing over the time that they've been here. And that's true whether you're in New Zealand or South America or Europe. People have been around for a long time, climate's been changing. So how can you really design a study where you can separate them? Surely, if it's dry, it doesn't matter whether people set the fire or lightning does, you're going to have more fires. And so I've been thinking, like where can we go and try to get the human signal independent of climate? And there is one place, it's the Polynesian Islands. And it turns out New Zealand is a great place to do this study because we know exactly when people arrived in New Zealand. They arrived 1280 AD. And do you know how we know that exactly? That is the radiocarbon dates of seeds that have been gnawed by rats. The oldest seeds with rat chewings on them in New Zealand always date to about that time. And so the Polynesians brought those rats, or Polynesian rats. They weren't on the island before then. And so we know really well when they came. And that's not a period of very remarkable climate change. So people came. They were very small numbers, 0.3 inhabitants per square mile in the South Island, which is the island where we're mostly focusing on. And DNA suggests that there's about 100 to 200 individuals. If you look at the charcoal record in New Zealand from older sediments, there's almost no fires in New Zealand. It's a pimple in the middle of the ocean. It never dries out. It's just wet. The fires are really rare. The return intervals are more than 500 years, sometimes more than 1,000 years. And you don't find any adaptations to fire in the native vegetation. None of those traits that I talked about earlier. There's no sprouting, there's no serotiny, there's nothing like that. Well, people came, and you can see in the charcoal records the fire frequency increased dramatically, and it goes to like a return interval of about 20 years, and there's this dramatic shift in the pollen record from forest to grasslands and shrubs, and you can see it so clearly in the record, and it's associated with a lot of charcoal. So if you look at a map of New Zealand, before the Maori came, most of South Island was covered by forest, shown in green. By the time the first Europeans had come in, over half of the island was deforested and was grassland. And the Europeans for sure burned as well. They sort of touched it up and extended it as they went about doing their agricultural and pastoral activities. And in the sediment cores that Dave McWethy was talking about, you can see here's a record going from the present day back to about 1,000 years ago. Here's the date of Maori arrival, this gray band, at all of these different lakes. And soon thereafter, there's a big rise in charcoal. And sometimes it's one event, sometimes it's two, sometimes it's three, these big peaks. It happens in about 50 to 100 years at any given site. It's not exactly synchronous, so it wasn't like a huge wave. But it does happen in the first few centuries of Maori arrival. And then there's often this sort of flat period when there might have been just low-level fires to burn to maintain the open vegetation. Maori burned for bracken fern. That was a big food crop for them. And then here come the Europeans around 1850s or so, and they had fires as well. But this initial burning period is very, very striking. So we can see in New Zealand that people really, especially when they introduce fire to a place where fire is rare, can really have a huge consequence. It's a huge landscape transformation. New Zealand hasn't really recovered from it because the species there had no adaptation to fire. So just to end, I wanted to talk about what's our future with fire as we look towards global warming. Well, for one thing, I think it's clear that we've seen all these big fires, and they're really expensive because people are living at the wildland-urban interface now, and it costs a lot to protect those houses from fire, as we've seen in various places. There's a lot of tactics to fight fires that you could argue whether those are ecologically well-meaning or not. And we're going to be living in a smokier world. There's no doubt about it as we go into the future. Now, in Earth system science, we talk about these kinds of situations. When we talk about global warming, we talk about tipping points. You know, what's going to be that point when the whole ecosystem shifts into another state? When are we going to surpass the natural resilience of the system as we know it now and move into something else? And in that tipping point language, they talk about what's the trigger that causes the tipping point. So you can think, for example, this is an adaptive landscape. Perhaps it's different types of vegetation. And right now we're in this cup. We're the ball and we're in this cup. And it's a very deep cup, so we're very stable. It's very hard to move the ball out of that cup. But what's the trigger that's going to move that ball out of the cup? What's the threshold? How high is that peak that the ball has to go over? What's going to amplify this situation and make that signal be even worse than it would have been just by one variable alone? How is it going to persist? How will the ball stay where it is? What's going to keep the ball there? And what's going to make this a globalized signal? And I think you can think about fire in the future in those kinds of terms. And you can talk about what's the trigger, what's the threshold, what's the amplifier, will cause persistence, and what will be the globalizer. So the trigger is pretty clear. Every projection of climate change in the future, and even these new IPCC projections that just came out last year, at the end of last year, show that we're going to be facing warmer summers and warmer fire seasons. These are graphs showing the May, June, July, August, September anomalies, changes in air temperature, and there's really no place that's getting cooler. Everything's getting warmer, no matter which model you use or how you combine them. So climate change is the trigger. What's going to amplify that fire signal? Well, we can see that from the paleo record. We can see that we're getting these huge erosion events after fire. We can see the frequency of those in the fossil record, that big fires are often triggered with debris flows, huge debris flows. We've seen that in Yellowstone. We've also seen this sort of linkage between insect outbreaks, disease, and fire. That's going to amplify the signal that we're going to see from fire. And then we have all these invasive non-native species coming in, and they're a game changer as well. So linked disturbances are going to amplify it. What's going to make it persist or stay in the changed state? And I think we need to really focus on species that we think are really vulnerable. What are the species that are not going to do well? Well, the species that probably will do well is lodgepole pine. I don't think we need to worry about lodgepole pine at all. But I think things like Douglas fir at low elevations, at least in the Rocky Mountain region, very slow to recover after some of these recent fires. It still hasn't come into Yellowstone. There's no seedlings of Douglas fir. It's getting replaced by other things. In the same way with the high elevation species, whitebark pine is very, very vulnerable to fire and very slow to come back. And so that's going to lead to persistence. So for example, whitebark pine, which is a high elevation species, when you look at projections of where it's going to be in the future, red is dead on this map for white bark pine. It doesn't persist. So there's going to be really strong lags that are going to amplify. And then, of course, the globalizer is us. And so even though I said most of the signals climate, I think I've given you enough examples to show where people have really had an impact, not only in starting fires, but in suppressing fires and building fires, and just our whole mindset about where fires should occur and how we should deal with them. So we need to keep that in mind. And we need to be strategic as we face more fires as to where we're going to target our effort. So if you think about ecosystems lying along a range of biotic conditions, those that we've seen in the historical record to those that are really highly altered today, or the physical conditions, those that we saw in the historical record, those that are highly altered, you can kind of array conditions along, you can array ecosystems along a gradient. Which ecosystems are really still in that historical range of variability, are acting like we've seen in the paleo record? Which ones are sort of messed up but still potentially functioning? And then which ones are these crazy new ecosystems full of non-native species that are behaving in new ways? And I think fire history records can help us really, we should be thinking about where to direct our attention when we fight fires. So we should focus them in areas where we can maintain or restore historical range of variability, like places like Yellowstone. Or we can at least restore part of that. We can either restore the function or the structure of the physical ecosystem or the biotic, and then maybe just give up on some of these novel ecosystems. So in conclusion, I would say paleoscience is really important because it gives us the way of looking at fires beyond what happens in the news every summer when we read about the big fires. So paleo, of course, we can talk about the conditions that give rise to an ignition. We can talk about the conditions that give rise to a fire event. But ecologists can look at bigger spatial scales and talk about a fire regime being governed by climate, regional controls, and vegetation. And the paleo folks, us, we can talk about even bigger scales. We can talk about meta-fire regimes. We can tell you what the whole range of fires are for the boreal forest of Canada. Are we exceeding that? And we can get away from the mindset of just focusing on the individual fire and what happens. So paleo fire science, I would argue, as I'm on my soapbox, it tells us about the historical range of variability. It tells us about thresholds. It gives us new insights into fire and fire climatology. And it also helps us separate the climate and the humans as they are legacies on the landscape. So thank you.
I'm wondering about the talk we've heard recently about fires that get close to civilization and how they're talking about there should be clearing the underbrush in order to make the fires more, manageable or something like that. But I'm just wondering that human intervention, perhaps on a large scale, would that be wise from your perspective?
So the question is, from your perspective, should humans be intervening at a large scale in the natural world to deal with fires like clearing underbrush?
I think it's really important to remember that not every forest has the same fire regime. And so a lot of the understory clearing that goes on is a ponderosa pine forest model, and it comes out of the forest school out of Arizona quite a bit, where they can see that there haven't been enough fires. There should be fires every few decades, and the shrubs are growing underneath, and then it's very flammable. But that's not the model for your western hemlock forests up here. How are you going to get rid of the shrubs here and make it more fireproof? So I think it can restore the forest to an open stand in some forests, but it's mostly ponderosa pine. It's certainly not the kind of recipe for wetter forests, and it's not going to be effective, and it would be a waste of money. So this idea, George Bush, after the 2003 fires in Oregon, the Biscuit Fire, he enacted the Healthy Forest Initiative, which was to basically log the forests so they wouldn't burn. And he actually made the statement that, you know, that we could make the forests fireproof. And
one can't do that.
I don't think so, no.
Next question.
Thank you. One of the things that was happening in North America just at the close of the Pleistocene was not only the appearance of humans and their strong effects on the environment, but also the disappearance of the megafauna. And I think we could argue that a number of the megafaunal species, the large mammals, could have played a significant role in maintaining forest openings, for example. So what do you think about the role of the disappearance of the megafauna in affecting these fire frequencies, especially in the late Pleistocene to early Holocene transition?
Yeah, there's been a...
Sorry, just so everyone can hear that, if I understand, can you give some comment on the role of the big mammals that were lost at pretty much the same time as the first humans came in to North America and how that affected fire?
They had to have been a factor, right? Because they have they're such consumers of biomass and fine fuel, and you know, it's another one of those things that's difficult to untangle because that all happened at a time of really rapid climate change, and so, you know, what changed the fire regime? Is it the megafauna, or is it the climate, or is it a combination? And you may know those studies that have looked at dung spores in lake sediments as a record of megafaunal presence, and then the loss of the dung spores are attributed to their extinction. And usually you can see what happens is the dung spores disappear as you're going up a core. You lose the dung spores, and then the fire regime changes. So that sort of suggests that there's a link, but I don't think the jury's in it. It makes sense, but the Australians have found the same thing. They've looked at dung spores and found the same thing, that there's a big change in the fire regime when the dung spores drop out.
Can I ask what a dung spore is?
A dung spore, all right, we all know what dung is, right? Okay, well, these are fungal spores that grow on dung. And they get washed into lake sediments, and they're identifiable.
So it's a marker of dung.
It's a marker of dung.
It's a mushroom marker of dung.
It's kind of, yeah, you know those spores. You've probably seen them, or at least I see them on, you know, bison pies.
The dogs that leave a load that doesn't get picked up and it sits in the forest for a while, it has little things growing on it.
Yeah, and you know, I don't know enough about dung spores to know if those are the dung spores, but I know
they're
exactly
related. They're related to those, I'm sure.
what you're talking about. Yeah, and you know, there's a lot of steps that have to be made in that record too, like, do the dung spores tell you about the population size of the ungulates? Why would they? I don't know. They just show you where ungulates present. And then how do they get into the lakes? How does a dung spore get into the lakes? So, we need the next generation of paleoecologists.
That's right. Next question or comment. Right behind you, Laurie.
Quick question. As far as climate change, like, is your goal to, I'm sort of ignorant, like this is why I came here as sort of an info session, but is your goal to stop fires globally or just in Canada, or?
Right, that's actually a good question. So, I mean, not your goal specifically, but how do we treat, given what you've told us, are we supposed to be trying to have fewer fires everywhere, or what are we supposed to actually be doing?
I think this should be an open forum for that kind of question. I think there's not much you can do. I think you just stand back and make sure your house isn't built in a place that's going to burn, because that's really where most of the money goes. And, you know, in our country, they've increased tenfold the firefighting budget for this year, and they've decreased by 20-fold the fire ecology budget in the Forest Service. So the people that might be able to tell them where to set those fires and that kind of thing, their budget's getting decreased because we're spending so much money saving houses. So I think the message is fires are a part of our future.
So don't build where there's fire.
Right. So that's the good answer.
Be smart
Fires.
where you build your house.
be smart where you build your house. We have a question here.
Yeah, I wanted to know a little bit more about this tipping point. Is that where one ecosystem changes into another? You were talking about triggers and amplifiers, thresholds. Is there a math you're using there?
Right.
Is there a general model? What is
So the question is, can you tell us a little bit more about this idea, this cartoon you had here about tipping points, and how does that feed into what we've been talking about fire?
There's a lot of math that's used to describe that concept, and it's this idea that there's multiple stable states in an ecosystem. Don't ask me to give you the math now, but that you can move something from one stable state to another by sort of pushing that ball over into. And so how do you do that is part of the mathematics of it. And it's used for a lot of examples. Tipping states are used to understand climate science, that sort of multiple stable states. And it's used a lot in Earth system science. Maybe you can comment on that. You've got a microphone.
No, but as I say every week, the last talk, which is number 7, not number 6, which will be Tony Barnowski, he will probably be talking about tipping points and some of the generalities. So you have to stay tuned for that.
And it's this idea that extreme events or abrupt events can often be that trigger.
Yeah. There is a lot of math behind that, and it's contested. So I think we'll have lots of time to talk about that on week 7. Otherwise, we can talk about it later. Next question or comment? Here.
I'm just wondering about volcanoes and the ash and how that figures into your studies.
Oh, so is volcano ash different, and how do you know that it's fire ash and not volcano ash?
Is the question, do volcanoes cause fires, or is the ash in a core from a volcano separate from?
Rise, perhaps, right?
Just tell us something about volcanoes
I'll
and charcoal.
tell you something about volcanoes. Volcanoes cause fires. New Zealand, that's really clearly documented, especially on the North Island. But they're not. It's not a widespread effect. It's on the flanks of the volcano where it's very hot ash falls, or there's molten lava. Once you get farther away from an eruption, the ash is not very hot. So think of Mount St. Helens or something. The ash was not very hot. So that's not really directly causing volcanoes, but it could dry the landscapes in ways that might make them more flammable in the future, I would think.
Does the ash from a volcano look different from the charcoal?
It looks very different. The ash in a volcano looks very different. It's a very distinct white layer. Whereas these charcoal particles, we have to really sieve them and look under a microscope to find them sometimes. They're not really dark layers that you just automatically see.
Well, people are cogitating. I have a question. So I think it was 97, 98, there were huge fires caused by the ENSO events in the tropical forest. And at that time, there was this worry that ENSO events, which are these oscillations that occur on a 4 to 7 year period, roughly, but would exacerbate fires globally. Do you know what the latest word is on that?
Well, part of the reason there were such large fires in Indonesia was because of slash burning, and it was so dry that it had actually dried out these natural wetlands. And so they were burning not only the surface, but they were burning quite deep into those wetlands, and there was actually a noticeable carbon flux to the atmosphere as a result of the Indonesian fires. So the fact that it was an El Nino, was a La Nina, actually gave rise to drought, which gave rise to fires. Human activities had an exaggerated effect. There's a bunch of papers coming out now that are talking about greening effects of climate change. I don't know if have any of you seen these? There's Central Australia has actually gotten greener in the last few years because of increased precipitation. And so dry areas are becoming greener. Not everything's becoming drier. And there's a lot of attention now in the climate community trying to figure out what the carbon signature of that greening is, as opposed to what we all think about drying, but how important is that as a sink, for example? And that's also related to ENSO.
Oh, Karen might have something to say about that.
When you show the long-term changes in fire frequency, and that's related to climate change, I assume one component is a temperature change, one component is a drying change, but are there associated changes in lightning frequency, and how is that teased out?
That's a great question.
Do you want to repeat it so that everyone can hear?
Please.
No, you can do it.
The question is, what do we know about lightning frequency in the past that maybe we're not looking? Model simulations do a terrible job simulating lightning, simulating convective storms and lightning frequency, and it's really a big unknown what lightning frequency is or how it changes. You can imagine it would change as atmospheric circulation would change, but there's just no good way of getting a handle on it, and it's kind of black boxed.
So we don't know if there's going to be more lightning in the future, for instance?
No.
Okay.
There's been projections that there are, but they're all a little sketchy.
So I had I had another question. Sorry, I don't want to. So it wasn't clear. Or it wasn't clear to me whether you espoused the view that, for instance, the Great Plains were the consequence of indigenous burning, or whether that was just a theory among several.
I don't espouse that view. I think we're in North America, wherever we look at the signature of prehistoric people through their use of fire, it's always very localized. In the Willamette Valley, you can see these strong drivers of climate shaping the oak woodland, but wherever there's an archaeological site, often the charcoal signal's anomalous. There's a lot more fires there. I think the Great Plains is the same way. There's areas where you get sort of anomalously high fire activity, but they're usually where people were. I don't think they created a whole biome.
Because that's a fairly contentious idea, right? That the whole Earth has been.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Any other comments or questions? Sir.
My question is, if you could say something more about how little ice age affected anthropogenic fires.
Right. So tell us a little bit more about the Little Ice Age. When was it, and how did it affect anthropogenically caused fires?
Okay, well, the Little Ice Age isn't the same time everywhere, and it's not always showing up strongly everywhere, but it's about 500 years ago and goes to about 200 years ago. And it's a cool period. It's very well registered in the northern hemisphere. It's not so well registered in the southern hemisphere. We know it was a cool period for a lot of reasons, so that wasn't caused by people. And so the idea is that during that time, because it's cooler and wetter, the fuels are less flammable. And so that's why the fire frequency would decrease then. And those decreases in fire frequency are happening at the same time human populations are increasing. So most people think when you have more people, you have more fires. So that's a case of where it seems to be a climate control overriding that trend.
So this all suggests, yep.
So where should I build my house?
So where should one build one's house? And what was the last part? Sorry?
Pitch my tent.
Oh, or pitch one's tent, yes.
Well, tents you have more options, I guess. The most flammable forests are the lower forests of the western North America. They're the ponderosa pine forests that burn frequently, or the Douglas fir forests. Those are the most flammable forests, and historically they've had a lot of fires. So those are really, when they talk about the wildland-urban interface, they're usually talking about that lower dry forest. But now, at least in my neck of the woods, people build to all elevations. So they really are messing around with the vegetation at all elevations. These rich guys with their, big houses way up in the alpine, it's like, wow.
What were you thinking?
Well, are we going to have to pay to fight those fires when they come, roaring up the hill?
So we've heard a lot about fires, for instance, in New Zealand. The past couple of there's been some big fires rolling through there. And of course Australia. And New Zealand, not New Zealand, Tasmania, sorry. There's big fires in Tasmania. So that's a place where there has been a fire history, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's just climate change.
Well,
Not just, but I mean.
the systems they get in Tasmania are very climate driven. They can predict them, they can see them coming, and they can see the ones they've had recently are very much related to drought. People have been in Tasmania, though, for 35,000 years. You know, so trying to sort out their influence isn't really clear yet.
Madam.
Probably slightly off topic, but I was interested in, was it said that in Tasmania it was the remains of the biosystem from Antarctica? Did I hear that in your movie?
Right, yeah, I caught that too. So there was someone said that what they were looking at was the remnants of an Antarctic ecosystem. Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, what David Bowman was referring to when he said that was the southern beech forest, the Nothophagus forest, which in the tertiary really extended into Antarctica. And it's in South America, in Australia, Tasmania, and fossils in Antarctica. So it's once part of this more extensive forest related to the end of Gondwanaland.
Right, so there's a connection between Tasmania and the southern tip of South America, in those
Yes.
beech forests. Which is,
Can I add one more thing to that? You used a word on one of your charts, and probably everyone else but me knew it. It was, I think, M-I-R-E-S.
Myers. Yes, I didn't know what that was either.
Okay.
What is a mire? Yeah.
Mean return interval. So it's the mean fire return interval. It's the number of years between two fires. It's the average number of years between a suite of fires, I should say.
There's also the term M-I-R-E-S. Mears.
And
Those are just another word for wetland? So it's another word for
mire.
wetland.
Yeah, that's a wetland.
That's a wetland, okay. 'Cause
Thank
that
you.
was the
Thank you for saying that. I need to.
Any other terms that were unclear?
Anything else? Any other questions?
The quiz on Wednesday?
Charcoal.
Anything else? Quagmire, that's where it comes from.
Did I use quagmire?
No. But you could have, I'm sure, several places, as in we are in one. Potentially. All right, last, yes.
Is there anything to be said about forest management and logging practices? Anything new as related to fire?
So, do you have any new insights to share with us about logging practices with respect to fire?
I don't, the idea that logging recreates forest fires, I think that's been dismissed now for a while, but hopefully nobody says that logging is the same as a wildland fire. For various reasons I can explain, but.
Is that news? Yes, Ralph.
Yeah, Arne, that was just, I think, because slash burning, which was a common forest practice here 20, 30, 40 years ago, after logging to get rid of the debris, that did start a lot of local fires, but I think that's been banned largely as a practice. Maybe that's what he's alluding to here.
No, I've actually heard that said in BC that one of the justifications for logging, large-scale logging, is because it recreates the kind of mosaic that the boreal forest naturally sees with its fire regime.
So I've heard that as well, that that's an argument. And you say that has been dismissed because...
Well, for one thing, fire leaves a lot of the carbon and the nutrients in place. When you're logging, you're taking it out. That's probably one of the biggest differences.
So they're qualitatively different. Sir? That's okay, I'll just repeat it.
So, because you were saying, I think at least the Pender example, but also the Clackawanna Sound example, we're saying kind of the medieval warm period is kind of the establishment for a lot of our old growth forests, and that's not actually that much of a temperature difference from what we are going to expecting to get with climate change. So are we likely to see a lot of those forests go in the not so distant future?
So the question is that you showed a couple of examples where there was a warm period, was a warm period which allowed for the establishment That was because it was followed by a cool period of our current forests.
It's the post-warm period when things got established. And I'm drawing a little bit on my own experience working in Oregon and Washington, but a lot of our old growth is about 500 or 600 years old. So it was established at the end of the period of a lot of fires and the beginning of the Little Ice Age. And so the idea that we're somehow going to see that happen again, or that we're going to replace it in the near future, is pretty unlikely because the climate is not going towards a cooler, wetter regime, it's going towards a warmer regime.
What I'm saying is like a lot of those forests are that old because we haven't had a warm period since, but now we're going to have it, so we're less likely to see forests that old again in the future.
Yeah, that could be. We could burn, I mean, if you keep reburning an area, you'll eventually burn your old growth forests. And there's projections for Yellowstone National Park that suggest there won't be forest in Yellowstone in 60 years because the interval is going to be so frequent that you won't have recovery. And then there won't be the opportunity to establish. And that's why I think Douglas fir, for example, is a very vulnerable tree.
Because it won't be able to reestablish.
Yeah, it just takes a long time for it to get going.
Sir.
You mentioned that one of the effects of forest fires is, of course, creation of a denuded surface that would be vulnerable to erosion. So one of the signs of a recent forest fire would be a truncated soil that is missing the most recent and has the evidence of the most recent fires because they've been stripped away by erosion. And that would give you anomalously older radiocarbon dates in that area for the previous fire. How do we correct for that?
So you're thinking
There's a very, just wait. That was a really technical question. So, so the question is, if there's lots of erosion caused by a fire, that's going to wash away some of the evidence that you might pick up in the charcoal when you radiocarbon date it.
For example, in the climate sound study.
So how do you deal with the fact that some of your evidence is washing away?
So the person that did that, Dan Gavin, has been asked that question, and where he got his charcoal from duff layers, basically from hollows that he dug into and could see no evidence that it had been disturbed. So not everything gets eroded to bare rock, and he thought that most of the watershed actually was pretty much intact. On the other hand, that lake in that picture is a landslide lake, so you know that there is some mass movement that goes on there, maybe triggered by earthquakes.
So the idea is you have to be very careful when you're doing these kinds of analysis for just those sorts of reasons.
And one of the reasons to be careful is because a radiocarbon date costs about $350. And so, yeah, if you're lucky, and so you don't want to waste them.
Exactly. Anything from the back of the room? All right. There you go. Sorry. So you alluded to a major shift in fire policy in the late 80s in the United States. So could you give us a little bit more information about that?
Yeah, it started before then in Everglades and Sequoia and in Yellowstone. They really were pushing the fire policy of wildlands towards a natural burn policy, where if fires were away from structures and just seeming to burn in safe places, they would let them burn. And then they had, so the largest fire in Yellowstone prior to '88 was about 25,000 acres. They were all pretty small since that policy was in effect. And then '88 just came and completely called that into question because a lot of those fires, not all of them, but some of them were natural fires, or they just, the weather conditions were such that they traveled. So now I know in national parks and wilderness areas, to fight a fire, to let a fire burn naturally, they have to meet about 10 criteria. They have to check off, and they evaluate that all the time, several times a day. And one of them is that there has to be enough people on hand to fight the fire should the fire get out of control. Well, most years when there's fires burning in parks, there's fires burning everywhere, so there's never enough people to fight the fire. So my experience is that's usually the call to fight any fire, no matter what the size, in the park. So now I would say the parks are much more onto fire suppression mode than they've been for a long time. Even though they still say it's a natural burn policy, it's got so many restrictions.
And to be clear, obviously it's going to be different for different places, but your intuition is that generally maybe not the best thing to do?
Yeah, so I'm speaking of western wildlands, and so that's parks and wilderness areas. I think we're going to move into a period of time when it's not going to matter what we do, because we're going to just have big fires. And, so let's be strategic about where we invest our resources, and let's not put people in harm's way, because of these large fires.
I think that's pretty much the take-home message, is that get ready for lots of big fires. Is that?
Get ready.
Yeah, all right.
Maybe this is the safest place to live, actually.
This week, anyway, it's been raining. All right, thank you all very much. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. I didn't see your...
What should I build my house out of?
So the question is, what should I build my house out of?
What is it? It's straw, and it's
What's
brick. And what was the first one? Sticks?
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Straw, sticks, and bricks. That's right. Bricks. We think it's bricks. So please join me in thanking Cathy Whitlock for a very interesting talk.